So good evening, everyone. You know that my initial plan was to talk about both the common law and written law, and then also the role of the king. And I realized that's way too much to cover in just one class. So we're going to do the law, legal codes, and some actual transcripts or letters or things that tell us about how law was practiced. And then in our next class, I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about the role of the king, and maybe also how trials were conducted in the ancient Near East. Obviously, there are differences between cultures and time periods, but it actually can tell us a little bit about, for example, the role of an oath, the role of swearing before God, things like that, which frankly we still do today, right? And in at least in American court, where you take an oath, right, that you're only telling the truth. So before God, right? That's what you're supposed to be doing. And so that is something that was very common in the ancient Near East, for pretty obvious reasons, because your evidence was being witnessed. Like, you didn't have, there wasn't really any kind of circumstantial evidence. It was all witnesses and actual physical evidence. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So today, and you can see from the handouts, I brought you pieces of law codes, and I brought you pieces of transcripts in terms of kind of court cases or things where we have the letter from Judea where someone's appealing to a higher authority, as it were, in order to get something that was kind of illegally kept from him. So we're going to look at some of the parallels between biblical law and ancient Near Eastern law, and also kind of the way ancient Near Eastern law and law codes were meant to work. Now, this is, I've said this before, but I'm going to repeat it again because it really is very, very important. The way ancient written law codes were supposed to work was people didn't like paskin, they didn't like rule from the law code. People weren't like looking things up in Hammurabi. Okay, there was actually for Hammurabi, it's interesting because there actually apparently are records of the king in that case, for a court to say to the king, okay, we're kind of boosting this up, and the king to give them a matter of law without deciding the case. In other words, using the king as a source of law was something that was actually happening, which is very interesting, which we don't really see. I mean, I haven't seen it elsewhere, and I have to look at the actual evidence in terms of the old Babylonian period, that you'd have a lower court say, okay, let's ask the king, and the king would not give the ruling. He would say, well, this is the law, and now you can rule according to the law. Which is very interesting. But the actual law codes were not meant to be ruled from. No one actually thought that people were going to be looking things up in a written law code. Instead, what the law codes reflected was what the king wanted, and it would interact with common law. Now, I did use the term when I was sending an email, oral law, because frankly, the common law in general was oral law. It was a law that everyone knew. Okay, and then it would come to bear in a specific trial. Now, obviously, if I'm saying oral law, we already are thinking in terms of Jewish law and Jewish practice, and that automatically puts us in that mindset. But I think it is worthwhile realizing that essentially that is the way that law worked in the ancient Near East. In other words, you had this common law that people knew, and then you had written codes, which they could reflect what the king wanted. They could reflect something that this is what you're supposed to do. But in numerous cases, we'll have court transcripts that show that no one is paying attention to these written codes. Okay. Just another reminder, everyone, unless you're asking a question, unless we're in the question and answer period, please mute your mics. Okay, so let's delve in. I'm going to take a look at the handout. So I always like to give you the cover page of wherever I'm taking every text. So your cover page there is Pritchard. We're looking at Pritchard. I'm actually going to skip around a little bit. We're going to get back to the Laws of Eshnunna in just a second. Instead, I'm going to go to the Code of Hammurabi, And I'm going to go to the end. I'll tell you the page in the handout and in the book in a second. Here we are. Okay, so if we look at the epilogue, which starts on page 9 of your handout and page 177 of Pritchard, okay, this is the epilogue that really says what Hammurabi means for this code to be. And we've talked about this before, but again, since we're discussing it I knew I wanted to talk about this. The laws of justice, which Hammurabi, it's the bottom of the page to the right. The laws of justice, which Hammurabi, the efficient king, set up, and by which he caused the land to take the right way and have good government. I, Hammurabi, the perfect king, was not careless or neglectful of the black-headed people. The black-headed people are the Babylonian people, whom Enlil had presented to me, and whose shepherding Marduk had committed to me. Marduk, of course, being the god of Babylonia. I sought out peaceful regions for them. I overcame grievous difficulties. I caused light to rise on them with a mighty weapon, which Zababa and Inanna entrusted me, with the insight that Enki allotted to me, with the ability that Marduk gave me. I rooted out the enemy above and below. Now, note that he's talking about all these powers and insight that he's getting from the gods. However, the laws themselves come from him. Okay, this is what he seems to be saying. Now, it isn't clear. Let's go to line 80. He says, I am the king who is preeminent among kings. My words are choice. My ability has no equal. By the order of Shamash, the great judge of heaven and earth, may my justice prevail in the land. By the word of Marduk, my lord, may my statutes have no one to rescind them. In Esagila, which I love, may my name be spoken in reverence forever. So he's calling upon the power of the gods to kind of stand behind his law. All right. However, and if you look, just skipping to the, let's say to the right column around line 100, he says, I, Hammurabi, am the king of justice to whom Shamash committed law. Right. So does that mean that Shamash gave him this law? It seems not. It seems what he's saying is that Shamash, as kind of the god of justice, has appointed Hammurabi to be the person who makes sure the justice is done in the land. Okay, so what is the point? And here we have the highlighted section that I have for you. Let any oppressed man who has a cause, I'm back on the left column at the bottom. Let any oppressed man who has a cause come into the presence of the statue of me, the king of justice, and then read carefully my inscribed stela and give heed to my precious words. And may my stela make the case clear to him. May he understand his cause. May he set his mind at ease. What it sounds like is an oppressed man can come, he can find his case on my stela, and then he'll be like, oh yeah, this is the just resolution to my case. What it's not clear is what exactly he's supposed to do with that. Is this after he already got a judgment? Is he supposed to do this before he gets the judgment so that he can argue this before the judge? Why is his mind set at ease? Simply that because Hammurabi understood his situation? Maybe the idea is supposed to be that he's like, oh, wow, I am so oppressed, but Hammurabi sees what justice should be done in my case, and that's enough. Hammurabi, the Lord, who is like a real father to the people, bestirred himself for the word of Marduk, his Lord, and secured the triumph of Marduk above and below, thus making glad the heart of Marduk, his Lord. And he also ensured prosperity for the people forever and led the land aright. Let him proclaim this, and let him pray with his whole heart for me in the presence of Marduk, my lord, and Sarpanit, my lady. And what it sounds like is, you've got this oppressed person. He comes, he finds his ruling on the stela, and he's like, wow, Hammurabi's so great. He's so great. That just sets me, now I am just fine. That's it. I understand. And it's good that we've got a just king. Okay. Now, at the same time, if we continue saying the days to come for all time, let the king who appears in the land observe the words of justice which I wrote on my stela. Let him not alter the law of the land which I enacted, the ordinances of the land which I prescribed. Let him not rescind my statutes. There is this idea, right, that there is this idea that the fact that he's created this law, it should be the law of the land. However, how this is going to work isn't clear. Judges aren't supposed to come and read it. An oppressed person's supposed to come and see how great Hammurabi is. That's how this works. And in fact, people don't cite, as I've mentioned before, people don't cite the Code of Hammurabi. We don't see that in trial transcripts, and we have tons of them. Sometimes they match what Hammurabi said, and sometimes they do not. Okay, but let's go into the Code of Hammurabi. And some say the Code of Hammurabi was actually composed based on some of these transcripts and some of these court cases that had already been ruled. So let's take a quick look. Now, I'll remind you of the dates. Hammurabi ruled, if we take the middle chronology, from 1792 to 1750 BCE. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the parts that are relevant for us in his code. We're going to go back now. He's not the first code by any means, right? Some people say, oh, Hammurabi, the first written law code. Not at all. Eshnunna, for example, is earlier. We're going to look at one rule from Eshnunna because it's got a parallel. Okay, so let's take a quick look. Let's start with something that's always nice because it shows off the Torah. It shows off the Bible in a nice light. Okay. And I always like those. So if you look at page 5 of your handout, page 167 of the book, okay, it says, if a seigneur has harbored in his house either a fugitive male or female slave belonging to the state or to a private citizen and has not brought him forth at the summons of the police, that householder shall be put to death. Okay, what is the case? A slave escaped, and a seigneur, which is a Wilam in Akkadian, and a Wilam is kind of the highest level that's not a noble person. It's like a completely free man, high class person. Most of the laws in the Code of Hammurabi are really meant for a Wilams. Okay, so if he's hiding a slave, he's going to be put to death. Not only, and I didn't highlight, if you take out, you say, well, maybe it's because he didn't bring him forth at the summons of the police. No, if you look at Rule 19, if he has kept that slave in his house and later the slave has been found in his possession, that seigneur shall be put to death. So regardless of whether this slave was called for or not, if he is harboring a fugitive slave, he is going to be put to death. Now, in this case, we have a contrasting rule, a biblical rule. If we look at Devarim, Deuteronomy, Chaf Gimel Tet Zayin to Yud Zayin, it's a 23, 16 to 17. So we have a very similar case, and I've mentioned it before, and I said to you I wanted to look more into the context. I have. Lo taskir eved el adonav asher yinatzel elecha me'im adonav. You shall not turn over a slave to his masters, right? Who is essentially was saved, who is like escaped to you essentially from his masters. Imcha yeshev b'kirbecha. He should dwell with you in your midst. In the place that he chooses from among one of your gates. In other words, the town, whatever city he chooses. Batovlo lo tonenu, right? He should live well wherever he wants, and you shouldn't give him over. You shouldn't oppress him. So what's going on now? Obviously, this is Devarim. This is Deuteronomy, which has a much more it's nicer. It gives moral reasons for everything. It has a very nice a feeling of caring for people. So it is a Deuteronomic law, right? It's we don't see this in Shmot, and in Devarim it's very interesting because we mentioned this before. So you would think, so who is this slave? Because we have two types of slaves, and we discussed this when we talked about debt slavery in the ancient Near East and in the Bible. There are two types of slaves. There are slaves from your people who are debt slaves, and they're slaves from other people who are just plain slaves. And when we talked about the debt slaves before, when we talked about when we talked about how there were these kind of sabbatical years that were created in the ancient Near East when the situation got too dire, in order to release debt slaves, they didn't release regular slaves. And they specifically would be like, we're not releasing regular slaves, just debt slaves, because regular slaves were just always slaves. They were property. They weren't this special category of debt slave. Similarly, when we have in Shmot, in Exodus, we have a distinction between the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave who was the debt slave, and then a regular slave, right, who was just a foreigner, a slave, a foreign slave. Now, in this case, what's interesting is when Devarim talks about the debt slave, it doesn't use, in other words, you could say Deuteronomic language, right? It doesn't call that person a slave. It tries to avoid calling that person a slave. It's like avoiding. It says you shouldn't keep, if one of your brothers is sold to you, then you shouldn't make him work more than 6 years. So it avoids calling him a slave. And in this case, it's referring specifically to a slave. It doesn't call him an Eved Ivri. It calls him a slave. It sounds like it's talking about a foreign slave who has escaped. That's what it sounds like. Okay. There's nothing in the passage to tell us anything else. On the contrary, it doesn't say if one of your brothers has escaped to you, which is the way it talks about the debt slave in Devarim and Deuteronomy. Okay, so it sounds like it is indeed talking about a regular escaped slave who you are not allowed to give over, as opposed to the Code of Hammurabi, which admittedly, Code of Hammurabi is very early, right? So it's a very early code, but it's not a surprising rule to say you're not allowed to keep an escaped slave, right? It's not surprising in a community that believes in slavery, that has slaves. It's not surprising to see this rule that you're not allowed to keep an escaped slave. It's on the contrary, it's much more surprising to see if you have an escaped slave and if a slave escapes you, you are not allowed to give him back to his masters, and he should just dwell wherever he wants. That's an unusual rule that we have biblically. Let's go on to some more of our parallels. Okay, so moving right along, I'm going to the next page, which is page 171 in Pritchard and page 6 of your handout. Okay. This is an interesting, okay, here, now, something that, and when we turn back to Mishpatim, to Shmot, to Exodus, we're going to see a very different tone. So there's it's a little bit unfair to pick and choose with these rules, because when we just take a rule in the Code of Hammurabi and a rule in the Bible, and we put them next to each other as if they're the same thing, it's misleading, because the whole way the rules are presented biblically, even in Mishpatim, which is like the most legalistic kind of section that we think of when we think of the legal rules of Shmot, of Exodus, and it's the closest in the way it's being presented to things like the Code of Hammurabi, where you say, if this, then that. Even so, as we're going to see, it's still couched very much in the language of, this is what God wants, this is what's moral. It's not just, here are the laws. Okay, so let's go back to, if the Señor, okay, so this is a story. Let's actually start. Let me just, if we look at Rule 132, so I'm on, again, page 6 of your handout, right-hand column. I'm looking a little bit earlier than the highlighted section. I'm looking at Rule 132. If the finger was pointed at the wife of a señor, again in a Wilum, because of another man, but she has not been caught while lying with the other man, she shall throw herself into the river for the sake of her husband. Okay, that's probably the River Ordeal. It's not actually saying she should commit suicide. She has to submit to a River Ordeal to prove her innocence. Okay, what exactly was the River Ordeal? It was apparently either to swim a certain distance or to hold an object of a certain weight in the water. Okay, a person who was drowning could be pulled out before they drown to death, and and then just judged guilty. Right? Like, you could have a River Ordeal where the punishment is actually not death. They save the person before they're drowned, say burglary, for example. But also there are cases where the king stepped in when someone who was judged guilty and then survived the River Ordeal, and they said to the king, "Okay, now what do we do?" But that was an ordeal that was actually used in court cases. So of course, we have an obvious parallel in our mind in terms of an adulterous wife and having her have to prove her innocence through some kind of ordeal, where she will die or not die, right? But if we continue on, So it's a case of, so all these rules are talking about are, here's a case where you have an Awilam that's your highest level regular citizen, and his wife is not faithful, or there's a question of whether she's faithful. So so the question is, when can she go to another guy? All right. So if you look at 134, Rule 134, this is where the highlighting starts. If the seigneur was taken captive and there was not sufficient to live on in his house, his wife may enter the house of another, with that woman incurring no blame at all. What's going on? He was taken captive in a previous rule, which you can see above. If he's taken captive and she has enough to live on, she has to stay faithful. But if he's taken captive and she doesn't have enough to live on, well, what's she supposed to do? She can go to another guy. Okay. If when a seigneur was taken captive and there was not sufficient to live on in his house, his wife has then entered the house of another before his return and has borne children, and later her husband has returned and has reached his city, that woman shall return to her first husband, while the children shall go with their father. Did anyone ever see, I think this was a Denny's commercial, right? I think it was a Denny's commercial where this woman she's there and she's with her husband, her kids, kind of 50s, it's black and white, and it's rain, and this guy comes in, and he's like, this is your husband, it's Harold. And she said, but Harold, you disappeared. He's like, what, you didn't wait for me? She said, it's been 10 years. And he said, it was all you can eat. It was the Denny's commercial, right? but the idea is, we do have this idea that if someone disappears or is taken captive, right? Now, the problem is that in Jewish law, of course, you aren't allowed to do this, right? You have to have proof that this guy is dead before you can remarry. And in fact, a captive situation is a real problem for a woman because she's not allowed to remarry. And we're going to see in just a second how strict the biblical rule is compared to Hammurabi. So if we look at what's the story here, where he comes back after the all you can eat at Denny's, he comes back and she has children with this other guy. It doesn't matter. His wife has to go back to him because she's his wife, and the kids belong to her husband, right? Nothing belongs to her. So the kids that she had with the second guy stay with him, and she goes back to the first husband. Okay. And then the next rule is, if when a seigneur deserted his city and then ran away, his wife has entered the house of another after his departure. If that seigneur has returned and wishes to take back his wife, the wife of the fugitive shall not return to her husband because he scorned his city and ran away. So if a guy runs away, she can go to another guy and she doesn't have to return to him. Now let's look at the biblical law for a moment. Okay. So this is it's again, we're looking at Devarim again. So if you look at Devarim Chavdala, Deuteronomy 24, okay, we're looking at the very beginning. Okay. Now this is also an interesting case when I talk about oral law in the Bible, or common law, right? In the Bible or in the ancient Near East, this is a classic example. Okay, so ki kach ish isha uve'ala. Okay, if a man takes a woman and has relations with her, vaya imlo timsachen be'inav, right? And if she doesn't find favor in his eyes, he doesn't like her. Ki matzaba ervat davar, because he found some kind of inappropriate behavior on her part. V'chatav la sefer kritut v'natan biyada v'shalcha mibeito. So he has to write her, right, essentially a contract that splits up the marriage and gives it into her hand, and he sends her free from his home. Okay. Now what's interesting is a couple things here. First of all, and I've said this on numerous occasions, but I'll say it again, we learn here how to give a divorce. We never learned how to get married. Right? There's no rule. This is how you get married. This is the contract that you do for getting married. This is what, no, everyone knows how to get married, right? Now, I have to say, I can say, well, people know how to get married and they don't know how to get divorced. I'm not 100% sure that this is assuming they don't know how to get divorced either, because the actual story here is the next verse. In other words, it's giving you the whole background. He didn't like her. He gave her a divorce, right? Okay. And this is what you did. So he gave her an official divorce. All right. Now we know how you give a divorce. Okay, but it's not clear that we didn't know that before. Why? Because the whole point of this verse is the next part. V'yatzami beto v'alcha v'tali shacher. She left and she belonged to another man. In other words, she married another guy. Usnei ha'ish hacharon. She's terrible luck, this woman, because the next guy also hates her. V'chatav sefer kritut v'natan biyada. And he wrote her again the same kind of contract, dissolving the marriage or splitting the marriage, and he gave it into her hand. V'shilchami beto, and he sent her from his house, or he released her from his house. Oh, or he died. Okay, lo yuchal ba'ala harishon asher shelcha l'shuv l'kachta liot elisha. The first husband who divorced her cannot take her back to be his wife. Acharei asher hu tama'a ki toivahi lifnei Hashem. Right, because after she became impure. Right, because it is an abomination. What's the abomination here? What's the abomination here? The abomination here is that the assumption is what's created here is legal adultery, right? In other words, here's a guy, he divorced his wife. He officially divorced his wife. She went to another man. She had relations with that man. Now the first guy wants her back, but meanwhile, she was with another man. Okay, so this is kind of a way, now in theory, now this is my interpretation, right? In theory, you could extrapolate that and you can have a situation where a man is essentially renting his wife out, right? If he just keeps divorcing her and taking her back, it allows a lot of leeway that would not be acceptable, okay? And so it's not allowed, all right? Now, so there's this idea, this general idea that this general idea that you can't take a woman back. She's been with another man. That's it, right? And that's as opposed to the Code of Hammurabi, where in numerous cases, right, in cases you could take her back. She can legally go to another man when you're still alive. Okay, I will tell you, when I was doing research on a Lithuanian weekly in Hebrew in the 1870s, right? It was 1870. It was a Lithuanian weekly. It was like Vilna or something like that. I remember there was a Soloveitchik who made like the best macaroni, and even better than the macaroni in Moscow, I think it was. It was like it is an ad. It was an ad. But every week, there was an ad looking for some man who had abandoned his wife. Every week, there was some, have you seen this man? Right? They just like got up and left. They just got up and left their wife, and they went to some other town, and everyone's looking for him so that he'll give a divorce to his wife. If we think of this as a modern issue, it's not just a modern issue. I did once see a responding ad saying, "We found him. Where are you?" In other words, we got him. Now where's the wife? And we'll settle this thing. But this is, and this is the sort of thing that the Code of Hammurabi is like, okay, he ran away. He ran away from his town. The point is not that he abandoned his wife. The point is that he abandoned his town, which makes him a rascal and a horrible person. So he doesn't deserve for his wife to wait around for him because he left his city, right? Forget the wife, right? But it's still an out. Let's move on to some other. Now the question always is, how, when you have a law like this, was it applied? We're going to get to lactus talionis. I know you're all waiting for like an eye for an eye thing, and we're going to get to that very soon. But I do want to say something about how much was this applied in real life. I believe I gave you the letter in the Newsy letter. Let's take a very quick look at the Newsy letter. Let me find it in our document here. It's towards the end. It's in the context of scripture. Just a moment. Yes, here we are, the Slandered Bride. Okay, so if you look at page 16 of your handout, this is, does it have a page number? Oh, it's actually page 269, I believe, but it doesn't have a page number on the page. Okay. And the Slandered Bride. And here you have a case, And you have these cases in the Bible and in other law codes of a woman where a man said she wasn't a virgin, right? He marries her, and then he's like, she's not a virgin. And if he's lying, then he has to pay. If he's not lying, then at least in the Bible, like she dies. So it's not, but all she has to do, frankly, all she has to do to avoid dying is bring out a sheet with some blood, and she's cool. So it's not that hard, honestly, to not die in a case like that. It's pretty horrible, but this is anyway. So I'm looking at page 16 of your handout, which is the second to last page. Here is a court case that was apparently a so anyway, let's take a look. The bronze weapon of the divine Ninurta took its stand in the quarter, and his alderwomen took their stand, and they did not convict Amasukal of speaking insolently against Enlil-Isu. They did, however, convict Enlil-Isu of slandering and abusing her. Okay, so it sounds like what he said was he was about to have officially marry her, like officially, I guess, have relations with her to seal the marriage. And he was like, no, she's not a virgin. Thereupon, Enlil-Isu spoke as follows, saying, you may convict me even more than now. Still, I will not marry her. Let them imprison me, and then I will pay money instead. Okay, so here you have a case where you know what's supposed to happen, right? He's supposed to pay money, and then he's supposed to marry her. And he's like, no way, guys. I'm not marrying her. You put her in prison. I don't care. I lost the court case. I'm not marrying this girl. Okay, so you can see that whatever law you want to apply, if the culture doesn't stand for it, it's not going to work, right? So he's like, I don't care. I believe what I believe, and I'm not marrying this girl. Okay, so and I'll pay whatever money, and you can put me in prison, but it's not happening. All right, so we see kind of the limits of law codes a lot of times when we read these actual cases. Let's move back now. We're going to look at an eye for an eye, and again how the rule is different in the Code of Hammurabi. But let me take a break and answer some questions. Okay, can you talk? So Susan Aronoff asks, can you talk about the existence of different blocks of legal codes in the Torah? What do text critics say? What text critics say would take me at least a whole class. In general, there's always text critic, like source criticism always separates Devarim and Deuteronomy from everything else, first of all. In other words, Devarim is its own thing. They call it the Deuteronomic code. They sometimes pair it with like the Book of Kings. They'll pair it with other books, but you have and call it the Deuteronomic history, right? But the Deuteronomic code, from a point of view of scholarship, stands on its own. And it's not so surprising. First of all, there are contradictions, right, between Deuteronomy and other legal and other codes, particularly with slaves. Like, how do you treat a slave who leaves? Do you give them stuff? Do you what are the rules, for example? So with a lot of things, there are differences. At the same time, the tone of Deuteronomy is very different from many other from the other law codes, and the whole tone of the book is different. Now the whole frame of the book is different because it's presented as speeches by Moses, right? So these are Mosaic speeches, right? And they are loaded with ethical explanations for everything. And it's very, very different. So what the classic example of what Torah did Josiah, right? Did Yoshiyahu find in the temple? What was the code? And the general explanation is it was Devarim, it was Deuteronomy. Now, I think people have kind of walked that back a little bit. Part of that is because of the Copenhagen school, which wants to date everything later, and they don't like them. Something would be that early, right? To us, it's late, but to them, but if you're thinking of it in terms of, oh, really, everything's like from the end of the first temple period or from the second temple period, then that would make it early. Just a note before I continue. You know that I've worked a lot on Second Temple texts, and you cannot say that Hebrew Bible, that the Torah is Second Temple. It doesn't work. It's not the same language. It's not the same tone. And all of Second Temple stuff is derivative of the biblical books. Like, it's constantly quoting them, and it just doesn't work. I think if the people who are actually active in the Copenhagen school knew Hebrew a little bit better, they wouldn't say what they do. Also, it would help them if they actually read real Second Temple texts, so they could see the difference. And in no way does everyone belong to the Copenhagen school. I want to say that. Like, they just really bug me, so I talk about them a lot. So at any rate, a lot of times Devarim is put in its own place, and that's why I'm kind of making a point whenever I take something from Devarim specifically. Okay. Then when you get in VaYikra, we're only going to quote one verse from VaYikra, Leviticus. So they split it into P and the holiness code, which is its H, which is its own thing. So you can already see it gets complicated, and I'm not going to go into it now. Right now, I'm just looking at kind of parallels and what they tell us. Is there any parallel text in the Middle Eastern codes that declares that the husband must write a divorce for his wife if he finds something unsatisfactory, rather than he may write her divorce in such a case? As far as I know, no. In general, and this is something that we'll see, in general, the ancient Near Eastern codes are going to give the husband a lot more choice than the Bible does. And part of that, again, is that they see it as a interpersonal matter. If he owns her, it's up to him whether he keeps her or not. Whereas in the Torah, it's a matter of divine interest, whether this is allowed to continue or not. Okay, so it's a different idea of what's at stake here. Okay, so as far as I know, no, there's nothing that actually forces a man to divorce his wife. If he's okay with her doing what she does, you know, I think I'm pretty. I don't. Yeah. So let's continue to an eye for an eye. Here we go. What you've been waiting for. Here we go. This is, I believe, on page 7. Let's see, 7 or 8 of your handout, but to give me a second and I'll tell you for sure. Okay, yes, this is page 7 of your handout. It is page 175 in Pritchard. Okay, so we're starting and around halfway through the left-hand column. If a seigneur, remember that's an awilam, has destroyed the eye of a member of the aristocracy, they shall destroy his eye. Here we have an eye for an eye. If he has broken another seigneur's bone, they shall break his bone. Okay, if he has done this to an awilam. Okay, so if a awilam does something to an awilam, he essentially gets an eye for an eye. If he has destroyed the eye of a commoner, that's a mushkenim. They don't really know what a mushkenim, what makes, they don't really know what the real distinction is, but commoners, okay, we can see that there's a distinction. If he has destroyed the eye of a mushkenim or broken the bone of a mushkenim, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If he has destroyed the eye of an awilam slave or broken the bone of an awilam slave, he shall pay 1/2 his value. Okay, and then once again we say with a tooth, if an awilam has knocked out the tooth of an awilam of his own rank, they shall knock out his tooth. If he has knocked out a mushkenim's tooth, he shall pay 1/3 mina of silver. Okay, and once more, if an awilam struck the cheek of an awilam who was superior to him, he shall be beaten 60 times with an oxtail whip in the assembly. Okay, and it can, it just out of interest, let's skip to rule 210, which is on the right. 210, so let's go back a little bit. If a seigneur, an awilam, struck another awilam's daughter and has caused her to have a miscarriage, he shall pay 10 shekels of silver for her fetus. If that woman has died, they shall put his daughter to death. Okay, so here we have an extreme case of an eye for an eye. Similarly to what we read when we were talking about rape, when we read the situation where if someone rapes the guy's wife, then the rapist's wife is also raped in return, right? This is a case where the woman is completely the man's property. That's her function. her property, his property, with a certain value, monetary value as well. And here this man has killed this other man's daughter, and so you kill his daughter. Equal measure, as just like an eye for an eye. In other words, it's a piece of him that you will now remove from him. Now, what of course is very obvious in the Code of Hammurabi is that in fact it's not an eye for an eye throughout. It's an eye for an eye if an Awilam does it to an Awilam, but as soon as he does it to someone of lower rank, it's money, baby. Okay, it's all money. You can pay them off. Right. Let's for a second. Let's compare it to the famous passage in Shmot in Exodus. Okay, so let me find the right place. Okay. And of course now I can't find it. Here we are. Okay. So in Shmot Chaf Aleph, Chaf Gimel, okay, which is 21:23. So it's Exodus 21:23. V'im ason yeh v'natata nefesh tachat nefesh. This is a situation where, in fact, where there was it's a similar situation. People fought and they killed. They hit a pregnant woman, okay, and she lost her child. If there wasn't a disaster, which one can assume means that the woman did not die, right? So the fetus was lost, but the woman did not die. They should be punished. I'm going back a verse. It's 22. Chafbet. Okay, but they should be punished as the husband of the wife determines. Okay, and if there is a disaster. Right, if there's an ason, v'natata nefesh tachat nefesh, there's a life for a life. In other words, someone's going to die for killing that woman. Ayin tachat ayin, shen tachat shen, yad tachat yad, regel tachat regel. Okay, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for a foot, kviya tachat kviya, petzach tachat petzach, chabura tachat chabura, a burn for a burn, and wound for wound. Right. What is the and this I couldn't find a parallel for in ancient Near Eastern codes. If any of you know of one, please let me know. Then it goes on and says, okay, what about a slave? Because we know a slave is a different story. So what if a person hits his servant's, or slave's eye, or his maid servant's eye, and destroys it? He shall set them free because of the eye. And if they knock out a tooth, they will also go free. Okay, now does this mean is this talking about an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, in which case it would be a debt slave? In that case, there are parallels. In fact, there are parallels in law codes that if they are overly beaten, they can go free. If it's talking about a regular slave or a regular maidservant, then there is no parallel to this, because everything else in the Code of Hammurabi is all about how if you hit someone else's slave, you owe them money. Okay, that's all the laws. It doesn't say anything about hurting your own slave. There are places where it talks about abusing a debt slave. Okay, and that can be cause for them to go free. So here we see a couple things. Okay, and this is the one place where I'm going to turn you to a verse in VaYikra in Leviticus, and that is in VaYikra Chaf Daled. So that's Leviticus 24. Okay, 24:22 Chaf Daled Chaf Bet. Okay. And it's a classic verse. Mishpat echad yeh lechem kager kazrach yeh ki ani Hashem Elokechem. Excuse me. Ki ani Hashem Elohechem. You should have one law as a stranger. So a citizen should be like a citizen, because or a regular dweller, right? A regular we'll call a citizen. The stranger is should be like the citizen, because I am the Lord your God. Okay. Now the idea is, and this comes right after, right, the Leviticus version, the VaYikra version of an eye for an eye. Okay. Because just an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, kasher yitain mum b'adam ken yitain bo, as he makes a blemish on a man, so that should be done to him, right? And someone who smites, in other words, kills an animal, will pay it. Adam yumat, and someone who kills a person will be killed. Mishpat echad yeh lachem kager kezrach yeh. You shall have one law, right? A stranger will be like a citizen. One law, specifically with this rule, specifically with this quite harsh rule, right? Saying that what you do shall be done to you, and if you kill a man, you will be killed. There is no payment. All right. You can't pay off a death. You can't pay off a death. You can't pay off a physical wound. And it doesn't matter what level of person you did it to. And that is a very clear contrast with the Code of Hammurabi, where the Code of Hammurabi is if you did it to someone of your own class, sure, the same thing's done to you, but lower class, it's just money. Okay. And that is, again, an idea, a principle that's being reflected, even it's being reflected very, very harshly in practice. I'm going to take a break and read a comment here. Do you think they really implemented these laws, e.g. killing someone's daughter because they killed his daughter? I imagine, I would imagine it would depend on circumstances. Like, I would guess that someone who really loved his daughter would be bribing people like crazy, or trying to come to an arrangement with the person accusing, or whatever they would do. I would not be surprised, however, that at least in some case it happened. Unlike a slave, an abused wife is not freed if her tooth eye is knocked out by her husband. That's actually very interesting. In the Code of Hammurabi, it does seem to give a situation where a woman herself, by saying to her husband, no, I'm not interested, like I have a headache, but forever, right, can just kind of get up and leave. That she can kind of say, she can actually free herself from a marriage. That it seems to be, in fact, where was this? I wrote this down. Yeah, I don't think you have it, but I'll read it to you. Give me just a moment. Let me find the right, because I have to go now into a different text, because I don't think it's in your handout. Hold on just a moment. Okay, so in Rule 142, I'll read it to you, and you guys can. Here we are. So I'm reading Rule 142 in the Code of Hammurabi. If a woman so hated her husband that she has declared, "You may not have me," her record shall be investigated at her city council, and if she was careful and was not at fault, even though her husband has been going out and disparaging her greatly, that woman, without incurring any blame at all, may take her dowry and go off to her father's house. Okay. If however, she was not so obviously pure and clear of any blame, they put her through the water trial, right? So, but the idea is, if you've been really blameless, you can walk out. It sounds like you can walk out of a marriage. It isn't clear to me whether what it's describing is a woman who's like, no, no, right? And then the husband goes to the court, and then the court says, no, release her. Right? Like, I'm not sure that the woman is totally in control of this process. It could be that the woman has an out if she says no, and then the husband goes to the court and he's like, she's been doing all this stuff. The court looks and she's not been doing any of this stuff, and she doesn't want the husband. He's like, no, she can take her dowry and go home. So it's not 100% clear that this is actually completely in the woman's control. Now, I do want to say, in general, when you have, and we take this for granted, that like, I have some control over, my own money and my own, what I do, and I can walk out of things and I can say no. In the ancient world, and even up to pretty modern times, and in some places of the world, it still is true, a woman can't walk out on a man unless she's got another man who's going to take her and protect her, right? Like, it would be hard for any woman in a situation that's not a modern civilized situation to say to a man who wants to keep her, I am leaving, unless she has another man who's going to be like, yeah, she's with me. And in which case you have all sorts of other problems.
Why can't she return to her family?
Okay, so this is the thing. If she has, all I'm saying is, sure, she can return to her family, right? We see, and we see with the Pelegish Bagivah, the concubine of Gibeah, that's exactly what she does, right? She has an affair, and then she goes home to her family, right? She's like, okay, we're done, and she goes home to her family, and then her husband comes to collect her, and the father's like, yay, you're coming to collect her, I love you, right? So everyone there in that story is acting weird, but the idea is you can go home, but first of all, if you have a husband who's not letting you go home, I don't know how in those days you could have gone home, right? I don't know how. It would have been very hard for your father to come and collect you, put it that way. Okay. And then if you do somehow get out and go to your parents' home, your father has to be willing to say, no, I'm not letting you take her. Okay. At that point, it becomes contrasting rights. And if the husband really doesn't want to let go, it becomes very, very hard for a woman without a man to vouch for her to leave the guy. That's what I mean. I mean, just technically, what is she going to do? What's she going to do? She needs some man who can physically protect her, right? I mean, we forget this because we live in this nice, in this society where we have this nice pattern of civilization, right? Except in unfortunate cases where it falls away, right? Please excuse my pessimism, but it's been that way. Like when I read about Eskimos, right? This was a classic thing. So Eskimos, they would share wives, right? But you had to ask permission. You had to ask the husband's permission. If the husband didn't give you permission, you couldn't have his wife, right? Because he owned his wife, right? And if he said to his wife, okay, I'm sharing you with this guy, then that she's shared with that guy. And if she left a husband, she was always leaving to some other guy. Like she was like, you just had all these cases where she went off with some other guy because that was the way to leave a relationship. Anyway. But back to our topic. What? Yeah.
We do see in the Bible some women living alone, like Aisha Mitzrafat, I think.
Yeah, you can live alone. Well, first of all, you can live alone, especially if you're like a widow or whatever. As long as and if first of all, so I'm gonna backtrack a little now. In general, there's a rule of law, right? There's an idea that men can't just go around grabbing women, right? The way law codes in the ancient Near East usually put it is this woman belonged to her father or this woman belonged to her husband. You have now committed a crime against her husband or her father, right? And now you have to either make good or in some cases die because of what you did to the other man in the story. Okay. Now, in the whole idea of protecting the widow and the orphan, which is it's not just in the Bible. Like there is this idea that you're protecting the widow also. She can't just be taken by a man, right? And she is quite vulnerable because she has property, et cetera, but you have to protect her interests. So yes, there is an idea that a woman can be a single woman. But in terms of a woman of usually marriageable age, she's usually presented as belonging to someone, right? And so she can be, she can be with her husband or she can go back to her family. Now, if she goes back to her family, now the idea of her going back to her family is that now she's not with her husband anymore. But let's say there was an actual abusive marriage. How to picture how she would get out of that? The only way for her to get out of that would be for her parents to rescue her. Now, frankly, I know of at least, I know of cases where that happens in the modern age, where a woman's in an abusive marriage and her parents saved her, that she couldn't get out herself because of this situation, right? But again, legally, in that case, legally. So here we see in the Code of Hammurabi a legal thing where she's saying to him no, and she is blameless, and they're like, yes, you can go home. All right.
I'm told that the mountain Jews what they did was there apparently, I don't know if it was a norm, but one way of doing a marriage was the man would see a woman he liked and he would rape her, and that was considered
Oh, that's horrible. Look, in biblically, that's considered like the case that is like that, which is in the conclusion of the Pelegish Begivah story, the conclusion of the Kavi Begivah story, is meant to be horrible. I don't agree with this idea that this is meant to actually be a solution. I've had this whole talk on that story before, where I think that conclusion is actually showing just how bad they let things become, but that they end up with a mass rape when they started with trying to solve a rape, right? It's considered a bad thing, right? And you're not allowed to do it. And in ancient Near Eastern law, you're also not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to grab a girl and rape her. It doesn't matter if she's promised to, like, again, when we looked at the rape laws, and when we have the Middle Assyrian law code that does talk about a single woman who's not promised to anyone who is raped, that is a bad thing. A man is not allowed to do that. Now, you can force him to marry her and pay money, or you don't have to have him marry her and have him pay money, but he did a crime. Now, the problem is that who did he do the crime against? In ancient Near Eastern law, the crime is against her father. She had a certain worth, and now he destroyed that worth. Didn't destroy it. He really impacted that worth, and that's the crime. The crime is against the father, as opposed to what we would say today, and what in the Talmud is very clear, right? Why does he deserve death? Because she would rather die than be raped, and so it's like he's killing her, and so he deserves death. So it's not that, oh, it's in Judaism, this is the way it is. No, but in the ancient law codes, this is kind of the way it's presented, that like crime is against her father. Now, I don't think that in actual fact it was that extreme. I think that if you look, for example, at them asking Rivka, so do you want to marry this guy? Right now, you don't see that in any ancient law code, that you ask the girl whether she wants to marry the guy. Like, why are you asking her? What's it her choice? You sell her, like, or whatever. You marry her off. But they say, hey, let's ask her, right? And so there is, and so I don't think that in actual fact all families work that way or thought that way. But in the legal sense, it seems to be that seems to be the attitude. Okay, so now let's go back to our law. So moving right along. Okay, so we talked about an eye for an eye and the differences in terms of the basic idea. Now, let's talk. I don't want to weary you with all this stuff, and it's already okay. So I'm going to do something quick. If you go up to the Code of Eshnunna, that's on the second page of your handout. Okay, the Laws of Eshnunna. Actually, it's the third page of your handout. I gave you the little introduction to the Laws of Eshnunna, and then I gave you, and then if you go down to the next page, which is page 3 of your handout, there's a piece that's highlighted, and it says, a man who is caught in the house of a mushkenim in the house during daytime shall pay 10 shekels of silver. He who is caught in the house at night shall die. He shall not get away alive. And that's interesting. And we have the same thing in the field. Actually, I should have highlighted the previous one, which is talking about a field. That he's in the field. If he's caught in the field in the crop during daytime, he should pay. But if he's caught at night, he should die. And in fact, we have a very similar rule biblically, which is. Oh no! And then I'm gonna have to search for it. Give me a moment. This is in Shmot. It's in X. Here we are. It's Shmot Chaf Bet Aleph. So that's Exodus 22:1. Im b'machteret yimatzei aganav v'ukav met en lo damim. If the thief is found kind of in a tunnel and he's smitten and he dies, then the person who killed him is not guilty of bloodshed. Okay. Im zarcha hashemesh alav damim lo. Okay. If the sun shone on him, he is in fact responsible. He is in fact guilty of bloodshed. In other words, if you find a thief at night, if there's a thief who's skulking around at night, you can kill him. If it's during the day, then you can't. Why? And it seems one can assume that the reason is the same in both codes, that if it's in the daytime, he's just trying to kill, to steal. If it's at night, it seems like he's ready to kill. You don't know what the hell he's going to do, and you're allowed to kill. Okay. So that's a nice similarity. Now let's take a look actually at a. This has been a lot of like kind of very dry written law. Let's go to some actual cases. So let's flip down here to, let's start. Oh, this is a nice one. Okay. So this is just fun. This kind of shows it's an interesting parallel. Let's look at the letter first. Okay. So if you look at page 11 of your handout, okay, this is a photograph of the ostracon, and if you go to the next page, it's the transcription in Hebrew. That's on page 12 of your handout. If you want to see the English, okay, that's in the context of Scripture. It's also in your handout, so you can see the English for it on pages 14 to 15 of your handout. Okay, so that gives you the English of the letter. I'm going to read the Hebrew and translate as I go, but feel free to follow in the English. So I'm going back to the Hebrew that's on page 12 of your handout, and I'm going to read it just so you know. This is from Haktav HaMichtav. Let me see. Can you see? Haktav HaMichtav. Okay. If you can handle Hebrew and you like original epigraphic text, highly, highly recommended. It's fantastic. Okay. Because it gives you a picture, it gives you a little bit of background, it gives you the text itself, and you can see here it gives you the text with and without vocalization and a little commentary. It's terrific. Okay. So here is a wage farmer writing to, and it seems to be the time of Yoshiyahu and the time of Josiah. It's based on where it is, because it was found in a location where normally it would have been outside of the realm of Yehuda, but in this case, but Yoshiyahu managed to expand the territory. So, and this is clearly a Judean, letter. So it seems to be the time of Yoshiyahu. If we remember that Yoshiyahu is considered this amazing king, who sees justice done. So, which works with this letter, because here's someone who has very little and he's expecting to be helped. And he's writing to the officer in charge. And he says, Ishma Adoni Hasar et Varavdo. He said, may my master, the officer, listen to the word of his servant. Avdecha kotzer haya. Avdecha b'chatzar asam. Your servant was reaping in chatzar asam. Vayitzor avdecha vayichal. Vasam kiyamim lifnei Shabbat. And your servant reaped and he finished and he stored it several days before Shabbat. Now, in Achituv Shmo, Achituv here is saying that this is Shabbat. In your English, is translating it as if it was a Shevet or Shavat. So, because it doesn't want to read it as referring to Shabbat, that it's like, before I stopped, right? But it makes more sense actually that it was before Shabbat, which would actually make this the earliest extra biblical reference to Shabbat. Kasher kol avdecha et Kasher kal avdecha et ksiro vasam kiyamim. When your servant had finished his reaping and stored it, right, for a few days, vayavo Hoshayahu ben Shovai, and so Hoshayahu, and this is another, you can tell it's a good Judean name. Hoshayahu, son of Shovai, came. Vayikach et beged avdecha. He took the garment of your servant. Kasher kalti eksiri zeyamim lakachet beged avdecha. I had finished my reaping for days, and he took the garment of your servant. In other words, he said, apparently the overseer, and the overseer said, you didn't finish your your quota. And because you didn't finish your quota, so in exchange, I take your clothing. And he said, but I did. I finished it. Okay. V'chol achaya anuli, all my brothers, in other words, all my fellow reapers, right, will answer me, will testify for me, right? Hakotzrimiti b'chom hashemesh, who reap with me in the heat of the day. Like, this is terrible. He took my clothing, and his job is reaping, right, in the heat of the day. Achaya anuli amen. My fellow reapers are going to answer me amen. In other words, they're going to say, yes, what he's saying is true. Niketi me'asham, I am innocent of any guilt. Vata yashivna et bigdi, v'malei lasar lashiv et beged avdecha. And now, may he please return my garment, and I am calling out to the officer. It could be either I'm calling out to the officer or I will pay the officer, but it doesn't sound right that he should be offering like a bribe or something. It doesn't make sense. I will call out to the officer, Lashiv et beged avdecha, to return the clothing of your servant, but titen elav rachamim, and may he have mercy. Vashevota et beged avdecha v'lo tadhimeni, and may you return the clothing, the garment of your servant, and not leave me helpless. Okay, so here you have an actual case where someone is writing to he feels he has an address. This is what's nice, is that he feels he has an address to correct this injustice. He is a reaper. Okay, so did an ordinary reaper know how to write and so eloquently too? Eliza asks. So the question is, did he write it, or did he go to some kind of village scribe or something who would write it for him on an ostracon? And that is a big question, because some people say, oh, look, this is a proof of literacy, right? It's a beautiful biblical Hebrew, right? And the question is it a proof of literacy, or did he have a scribe who could do this for him? There's no way to really know, okay? Now the question, well, if he doesn't have a garment, did he have money to pay a scribe? Who knows what the village scribe was paid it for writing a letter like this? Maybe he just needed, like, I don't know, some wheat. But he's writing and he's asking. Now, the parallel that jumps to our minds, right, is in Shmot Chaf Bet Chaf Hey. Let me get that for you. Okay, so Shmot Chaf Bet Chaf Hey says, Exodus 22:25. Im chavo tachbol salmat re'echa ad bo hashemesh tishivenu lo. If you take as a mashkon, what is the word?
Collateral.
What?
Collateral?
Yes, collateral. Thank you. If you take as collateral the garment of your fellow, you need to return it to him by sunset. Because that is his only cover. And it is the clothing for his skin. But me'yishkav, and what is he going to sleep in? And behold, if he cries out to me, and I will hear, because I am merciful. Okay, now I love this. It's one of the clear examples of how different the law code is in Shmot, even when we're using all these terms. Right, if such and such a thing happens, you should do this. Right, we use in many cases very similar structures in Shemot and Exodus as we do in the Hammurabi Code. But in the final analysis, there are a lot of places like this where it's like, don't do this, because look what you're going to be doing to him. Then he's going to call out to God, and I'm merciful. And the implication is, and what's going to happen to you, buddy, right? So, and what's nice also is this letter is saying, may you be merciful, right? That is the idea. On the one hand, it's justice. On the other hand, it is a call for mercy. Now, I do want to, and similarly, in Devarim Chafdal Yudzayin, in Deuteronomy 24:17, it says not to take a garment as a collateral at all, right? But not in general. It's I think it's for the widow or the orphan, I think it is. But the fact is, of course, it's different, because we're not talking about a collateral issue here. No one took his clothing as collateral. They took his clothing because he didn't fill his quota, right? Because that's the argument. The argument is he didn't fill his quota. Right. The argument isn't that he didn't return it to me by sunset. His argument is he took it away from me, even though I did nothing wrong. right? At the same time, we see the reality that's reflected in both the letter and the biblical law. This reality that I've got one garment. That's it. I need it. I reap in the sun, for God's sake, right? He took it away from me, and I need it back, right? And also the appeal to mercy because of this situation. So it's nice to kind of see the parallels in actual life. Let's look at some other things that can kind of flesh out the situation, the legal situation, as it were, in the Near East. Let me move down to, okay, so I'm moving now down to, we already talked about the Slandered Bride. The goring ox at Newsy. Okay, so let's look at the last page of your handout. Okay. Here we have a situation, and this tells us a little bit about how court cases work. And we'll go back then and look at kind of the ox goring situation. We all know it very well from Shemot, from Exodus, and we also have it in Hammurabi. Tehiptila, I'm now on the last page of your handout. Tehiptila, son of Puhisheni, went to court before the judges against Tiah, son of Warad Ahi, saying, Tiah the oxherd of Tehiptila, he injured one ox. Said Tiah, his fellow ox injured this ox out on the range. But the judges said to Tiah, bring your witnesses to the fact that his fellow ox injured him on the range. Tiah said, my witnesses are not there. The judges said, it is you who injured him. Pay the equivalent of the ox. Tehiptila won the lawsuit, and the judges ordered Tiah to pay one ox out of his own herd or funds. So what's going on here? Okay, you have someone who's an ox herd for someone else. Okay, and an ox was injured, and he said this ox was gored by another ox. They're like, yeah, bring proof. All right, this was the difficulty of court cases in the ancient world. How are you going to prove that what you're saying is true? And he couldn't prove it. He couldn't prove it, so he had to pay for it. Okay, that is why both biblically and in the Code of Hammurabi, if you let's take a quick look. Actually, we're already at 9:15, so I'll leave it to you guys. You'll see it. It's highlighted in the Code of Hammurabi there, and it's number 251 in the Code of Hammurabi. So the story is if you have a situation where actually no, never mind. Go to 266 is what is the relevant one here. So let me actually, I'll go to that if we're already doing it. So we go to 266 in the Code of Hammurabi. 266. Okay. Okay. Here we are, 266 in the Code of Hammurabi, page 9 in your handout. If a visitation of God has occurred in a sheepfold, or a lion has made a kill, the shepherd shall prove himself innocent in the presence of God, but the owner of the sheepfold shall receive from him the animal stricken in the fold. Okay, this is the classic if a lion has attacked. And you have the same thing in Shemot and Exodus, that if a lion, if a wild animal attacks your flock, that is a reason for you not to be held responsible if you're the shepherd, okay? But what you have to do is you have to bring the carcass of the animal as proof that they were attacked by a wild animal, okay? We mentioned last time, and I'll say it again, this is probably what's going on when the brothers bring Yosef's bloody coat to Yaakov, and they say hakerna. That's a legalistic phrase. We see it later with Yehuda and Tamar. There's a court case going on. It's like a court case going on. They're saying, recognize, is this your son's coat? And it's full of blood, right? So it must be. And then he has to say, oh, a wild animal ate him, because he has to recognize this evidence that they're bringing, okay? That's why in this past week's parsha, right, that we read, Yaakov is saying, you're going to take Binyamin. And then he says to him, Yosef is gone and Shimon is gone, and now you're going to take Binyamin. That doesn't sound like a guy who doesn't blame them for Yosef, Okay, it doesn't sound like a guy who doesn't blame him from Yosef, but he couldn't do anything because of the evidence. He had to recognize this evidence that Yosef was killed by a wild animal, even though he suspected. And that's why he says, you're going to take Binyamin. What happens if a son, an act of God happens to him on the way? Here I'm sending Binyamin with you. What if some other act of God happens to Binyamin? Then I lose Binyamin. Well, why would that happen to Binyamin? The other answer is because the brothers did it to Yosef already, right? Yaakov has his suspicions, but he has to recognize the evidence that they brought him, like a shepherd would bring for a sheep, because they, of course, are responsible for their younger brother, like a shepherd is responsible for his sheep. Okay. Yes, Yaakov telling Lavan how scrupulous he was about Lavan's flocks. There's a whole thing about what the story is with a shepherd who's watching flocks and how he's responsible, etc. There's a lot in that in the Code of Hammurabi also. There's a whole thing about ox goring. I can see I'm losing everyone, but I hope not losing everyone. But the difference in the ox goring scenarios in the Code of Hammurabi and the ox, well, let's just go very quickly. Here we are. Okay. In the Code of Hammurabi, find the right ox scoring, that's 251. So if an ox, I'm reading from page 8 of your handout, if an ox, when it was walking along the street, gored a seigneur to death and wheel him to death, that case is not subject to claim. This is similar to to biblically, where if he's not a goring ox, you don't hold, then you can't really hold the owner so responsible, right? I mean, you have to pay for damages, but if a seigneur's ox was a gorer, and his city council made it known to him that it was a gorer, but he did not pat its horns or tie up his ox, and that ox gored to death a member of the aristocracy, he shall give 1/2 mina of silver. Okay, so the answer is payment. He was a goring ox, and he killed someone, and the answer is payment, and that is quite unusual compared to the compared to the biblical text. I'm going to read this. This is from Shmot Chaf Aleph, Chaf Chet on. So that's Exodus 21:28 on. V'chi yigach shor et ish o et isha ubamet sakol yisakel hashor v'lo yechel et b'saro uval hashor naki. So if, unlike in the Code of Hammurabi, here the ox itself is killed. If an ox gores a man or woman to death, you stone the ox. You don't eat its meat. But the owner of the ox is innocent. If he's a goring ox from before, and the owners knew this and they didn't watch him. Very similar situation to the Hammurabi Code situation. And he killed a man or a woman. Hashor yisakel v'gam ba'alav yumat. The ox is stoned and his owners are killed. They are directly responsible for the death. They can't just pay it off. They're directly responsible and they die. Okay. There's another situation where there's this idea that a murder has been done and now that's it. Okay. So let's kind of, so we looked at a lot of different parallels. We looked at some differences. So let's kind of wrap it up. Okay, so a few things. So first of all, we saw that the actual cases on the ground could be very different from the written law. And there was a lot more leeway in terms of someone saying, no, I'm not going along with this. We also saw that the Code of Hammurabi leaves a certain amount of leeway that the Torah law doesn't. Okay, because the Torah law is seeing things as affecting the relationship with God. Okay, whereas the Code of Hammurabi is simply a civil law, right? It's presenting it as, inspired, protected by the gods, etc. But this is a civil law. Okay, so if you can get away with paying money, you pay money, right? Whereas, or if a woman, she goes to one man and then her husband comes back, she goes back to another man. But whereas the Torah law is very centered on, no, this is going to be defiling the land, or it's going to be causing a problem with relationship with God. At the same time, the morality of the law is baked into the law itself in the Torah code. Where, so for example, you have to return this piece of clothing to this man before sunset. Why? Because it's his only clothing. Think about this guy, right? And at the same time, also the eye for an eye rule, lex talionis, that rule is applied across the board, and it's presented as being non-discriminatory, right? It doesn't discriminate between people, as opposed to the Code of Hammurabi, where your appendages are worth more or less depending on what rank you are. That's really what it comes down to. If I'm a mushkenim, my appendage is worth money. If I'm an awilim, then the person actually has consequences on his own body, right? And so we see that there's a principle that we have in the Torah that just directly, I think it's actually being even said directly in opposition to code like Hammurabi, because it's said in the context in VaYikra, in Leviticus, it's said specifically in that context, in the context of that rule, the eye for an eye rule, saying, no, you have to apply it across the board. There isn't a difference between people here. And we also see that the biblical law allows certain rules for morality that are surprising, like the Deuteronomic rule that you can't give up a slave, which is the exact opposite of the rule in the Code of Hammurabi. Okay, distance of time, and but at the same time, it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense in a community where people have slaves for you to not be allowed to give your slave back. Like, if you put morality aside, but with morality, it becomes, how can you do that? The slave escaped. How can you give him back, right? So the mix of morality and law, it really is unique in the Torah. It's not like these law codes, and you'll see it even in Shmot, in Exodus. You see it even in VaYikra and Leviticus. You don't just see it in Devarim where you expect it, in Deuteronomy where you expect it. Okay. And what's nice is when you yes.
Do we see this? This is very interesting what you just said. Do we see this issue of emotion or mercy in other Near Eastern codes besides the Torah?
So you see the idea of justice very much in the beginning and in the end. And it's not that they don't believe in justice for the widow and the orphan and the poor. Like, they'll say, and I protect the oppressed, right? But in the code itself, you don't see moral reasoning, right? Now, you can't say, oh, there was no moral reasoning behind it, right? But there's nothing talking about moral reasoning in the code itself. It simply says this is the law. And of course, sometimes it's horrendous, like the thing where one man's wife is raped, so the rapist's wife is raped in return. Or this guy killed this person's daughter, and now this other person's daughter is killed, right? Horrendous things, right? Which we don't have in the Bible, right? And but even there isn't any moral stuff in the law itself, but there are moral exhortations in the introductions and conclusions, right? Look how just I am, and I protect the oppressed, and I protect the widow and the orphan. So it's not that there's no idea, there's no principle of being merciful. It is not, however, in the law code itself, in the body of the law code. I mean, it's interesting when we looked at
You're talking about Hammurabi right now, but are there any other codes?
Yes, there are other codes. There are Eshnunna, there's the Middle Assyrian code, and they read very, very similarly. In other words, these are the laws, right? And that's pretty much how they read. I don't know of a code that's like the Torah law code that mixes it like that. All the law codes I've seen have been very kind of, this is the law code. We have a few, So it's not that, so we have a nice range of them, but it's interesting because, like, for example, if you want to talk about mercy, we talked about this a little bit when we were looking at the Hittite king prayers. He has this prayer saying, if it's a poor person who's done this bad thing that brought this plague, can't you just punish the poor person, even if he's poor? Like, I know, like, because God is merciful, but punish the poor person anyway. Right? Like, he has this idea that you're going to be more merciful on poor people, but in this case, right? So it's not that no one had this idea of being merciful, but it's not something you mix with your civil law. And again, your civil law doesn't have any effect except that civil nature. Whereas biblically, it's repeatedly mentioned that this is going to, this is an abomination for God, or this is going to, lead the land astray, like all sorts of things like that. And also you have the moral explanations. Any other questions? Let me see if I missed anything. Going back to the Pelegish Bagiva, the concubine of Gibeah. So Susan says, I think the Pelegish, his father, was trying to rescue her through all of his delaying of the departure. You could read it that way, but also there's a lot of weird stuff going on. What happens with because he's delaying her departure, it's very weird because he's super happy to see the husband, and then he keeps delaying their departure, and because he's delaying the departure, the husband gets annoyed and leaves in the afternoon, which is why they're stuck at night with nowhere to go, and they end up in Gibeah and Gibeah. Like that's one of the, everyone's doing the wrong thing, and just one thing leads to the other. But yeah, you could read it that way. But her father's acting weird. Just in general, he's acting weird. Let me see anything else. Okay, so again, we see kind of the parallels. There are specific parallels. There's some tremendous contrast, and also, as we've seen so frequently when we compare biblical texts with ancient Near Eastern texts, even when we find some very strong specific parallels, a lot of times the whole tone of the document, of the text as a whole, is very, very different, and kind of has a different purpose as a whole. So thank you for joining me. And next week, I hope to talk a little bit more about the role of the king, and in general, how these trials were conducted in the ancient Near East, and comparing them to some biblical trials. Okay, so looking forward to it. Take care, everyone. Be well. Have a good night.